go ahead and stop sharing. And we can introduce our speaker. I am really excited to introduce our speaker, Dr. Samantha Montano, who became interested in disasters following a trip to New Orleans immediately following Hurricane Katrina and the levee failure. She spent years in New Orleans working with various nonprofits on recovery efforts related to both Katrina and then the BP oil disaster in 2010. In 2014, she interned for Foundation Beyond Belief, which is how I got to know Sam. And she's been an atheist since around the time she found out Santa Claus wasn't real. Same for me. Her educational background includes a BS in psychology from Loyola University, New Orleans, and an MS and PhD in emergency management from North Dakota State University. I'm ecstatic to introduce Dr. Samantha Montano.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. Let me just share my screen here.
Up the volume so we can hear you better. Let's see. Can Samantha, will you talk a little bit?
Sure.
All right, we're good.
Good. Awesome. So hi, everyone. I'm really happy to be here with you all today. So the book that I have just written, Disasterology, Dispatches from the Front Lines of the Climate Crisis, is an effort to introduce people, kind of the general public, to emergency management, which is a field and an area of study that I find not many people are super familiar with, or at least don't have any kind of like depth of knowledge about this system. And it's a really important system. It's operating all around us all of the time, and particularly given our increasing risk around the country, in part because of the climate crisis, the emergency management system is kind of more important than ever before. And so I wanted to write a book that could bring research to the general public, and also in a way that was not a boring read. So throughout the book, I tell stories about the different disasters that I've been to, the different places that I've gone to learn about disasters, to help, make it a bit more of an engaging read. So today, what I'd love to do is just kind of talk through how I got started doing this work, kind of talk about some basic pieces of our emergency management system, and talk about how this connects to climate change. And then I'm happy to leave some time for questions at the end and answer any questions that you might have. So as Ben mentioned, I first got started doing disaster work in New Orleans following Hurricane Katrina and the levee failure. I grew up in Maine, so I was very far removed from Louisiana and from what happened. I was in high school at the time also, so I saw some of it on the news, but I was pretty far removed from the situation and had never experienced a catastrophe on that scale in New England, obviously. And so it was kind of difficult to really understand how severe the situation was in New Orleans, particularly kind of months after, once there stopped being that wall-to-wall news coverage. So I had an opportunity to go down to New Orleans to volunteer just for a week on, a spring break trip. And we got there, and pretty immediately I realized that the scope and scale was so much bigger than I had understood. It was, every single road that we drove down, people still didn't have electricity. There were just these mountains of debris on every single street corner that had not been picked up. People had handwritten street signs because those were all gone. The traffic lights weren't working. There were no stop signs. The entire city, just every single thing we saw needed to be rebuilt. And so we helped that week. We helped gut homes. We helped rebuild homes. We talked to the other New Orleanians, the homeowners that we were working side by side with. We met all of these volunteers from all around the world, really, that were there doing the same thing we were doing. And through that week, I got my first taste kind of how our existing emergency management system, or really at the time, the way I thought about it, our government was not meeting people's needs in this kind of short-term recovery period that New Orleans had entered into after the response. And so despite the fact that New Orleanians were working very hard, and despite the fact that there were volunteers that had come from all over the world, it was still very clear that more help was needed. And so I decided to move to New Orleans, which is maybe like a little bit of a dramatic decision. But I went home, announced to my parents I was moving to New Orleans, and I started to work with all different kinds of recovery organizations throughout the city. We, did more home rebuilding. We were helping fill out FEMA paperwork, insurance paperwork. We were helping with childcare, so parents could go meet with, the electric company to try and get the electric turned back on. Literally anything that needed to be done in the city, there was some nonprofit that needed help doing it. And so I kind of just skipped around to these different nonprofits, kind of filling in and helping as needed. While I was living in New Orleans, the BP oil disaster happened down along the coast of Louisiana. And I had been working with a few different environmental nonprofits in the city that kind of dropped the work they were doing there on recovery and started going down to the coast to help with the immediate response there. And that was the first time kind of driving back and forth to the coast that I had a front row seat to experiencing the inefficiencies within an actual response to a disaster. So with Katrina, I had kind of showed up after the fact, and I had heard all the stories about the failed response, and obviously was learning about that failed response. But again, to kind of see that unfold in the moment is a very different experience. And so with BP, I really started to see on this kind of like grander scale these inefficiencies in the response, particularly when those responses have to include all kinds of government agencies from the federal level on down, and industry and the private sector, and the challenges and lack of coordination that can come about when you have these very different organizations trying to, or well, some of these organizations trying to work together. And you have kind of different groups with different interests throughout a response. So while I was spending time on the Louisiana coast, helping with like community organizing work, helping with getting media coverage of the local folks in places like Grand Isle, where the national media was kind of coming into Louisiana, but very often the local folks weren't the ones being interviewed. So trying to help get media coverage of their experience, helping to track the health impacts that they were experiencing. We brought in some activists from out of state who had dealt with oil spills before, like Buyout from Exxon Valdez in Alaska. We brought her in so that she could help work with the community to prepare them for what the legal battles were going to look like. Again, kind of similar to post-Katrina, anything that kind of needed to be done to fill those gaps. So in the process of going down to the coast a lot, I all of a sudden kind of had a newfound appreciation and a newfound sense of urgency regarding climate change. So again, like I said, I grew up in Maine, so climate change was something we talked about in my classes growing up. It was something that I was aware of and worried about to an extent, but it's still, even then in 2010, seemed like something that was somewhat far removed in time. It was still very much at that point, the narrative was this was something that affects our grandchildren, not us. And even in the context of rebuilding in New Orleans, when we were addressing environmental issues and doing things that maybe you would associate with climate change, like putting solar panels on people's roofs after we had rebuilt their homes. It was kind of the narrative around that was, well, we're putting solar panels on the roofs because it's going to lower their electric bills month to month. And, you know, we're dealing with people who are living in poverty. So that is why we're doing this. This is why this is important. The environmental benefits are kind of secondary. However, if any of you have been down to the coast of Louisiana, when you drive out on some of these roads out there to places like Grand Isle, you all of a sudden are kind of confronted face on with climate change. So you see where there are old roads that are now underwater. The area around this used to all be wetlands. Those have disappeared. You see sea level rise, you see subsidence. You see erosion happening right in front of you. And then at the same time, you also see the causes of this loss. You see industry everywhere, the oil rigs out in the water. You see the refineries along the coast. You see oil trucks driving by you on the highway that's been built up for the purpose of those trucks being able to come inland. And it's a really powerful experience, and it completely changed kind of my understanding of disaster. To that point, I had really been kind of very narrowly focused just on Katrina in New Orleans and kind of thinking about Katrina as this kind of one-off, really unique event that happened, and that was like never going to happen again, right? And then, you know, by the time you have the second catastrophe in basically the same area 5 years later, you start to kind of question some of those things. And so it also kind of just made me think more about how climate change was affecting our disaster risk across the country and what it meant that if in New Orleans we didn't have the resources to recover, and in both New Orleans and BP, we saw these failures in the actual response to these events, what did that mean for the rest of the country? And what did that mean for our future if climate change means more disasters? So, and the other photo here is a photo from 2019. I took a group of students down to the coast of Louisiana. We're standing right kind of along the side of the road, and I'm showing them how you can see these causes and consequences of climate change in this one specific spot. This also, as it turns out, this past fall was right outside Port Fourchon, which is where Hurricane Ida made landfall in Louisiana and wiped out large parts of Grand Isle and these other small rural Louisiana towns that are along that road that we used to drive down to get to the coast during BP. So after my time in Louisiana, I was thinking a lot more kind of about this question of disaster more broadly, thinking about what it is that we can do to prevent disasters, how we can make them less bad when they happen, how can we respond more effectively to them, and also how can we help people recover more quickly and more justly. Recovery is something that a lot of people don't really think about unless they're going through it themselves. It's something that, you know, maybe you kind of think, well, it'll take them a few months or maybe a couple of years to recover. But of course, there are still people in New Orleans 16 years later who have not been able to return home, who are still working on rebuilding their houses themselves in certain parts of the city. So how can we move through that recovery process better? And of course, I had a bit of an inclination to try to approach this in terms of research, which led me to graduate school, where I got my PhD in emergency management and started to study disasters, study emergency management, with the intent of kind of finding solutions to the problems that we have in our system and bringing those solutions from research into practice. So how can we be doing this in a more kind of empirically driven way? So that's how that is how we've ended up here. If you're interested, when we talk about emergency management, there's the profession and then there's the discipline of study. So I'm a researcher, I'm in the discipline. But the profession of emergency management, these are the people who are emergency managers that work in emergency management agencies across the country. So folks that are working within FEMA, but also our state level agencies and our county and local agencies as well. And they are working on a lot, or they should be working on a lot. This is what we call the disaster life cycle. And this is what we kind of organize the work that emergency managers do around these 4 phases. So you have response, which is when you're doing those life-saving measures to save lives, save property, save the environment. Usually that's a relatively short period of time. There are some, usually like a week, 2 weeks, maybe. Some notable exceptions, COVID, for example, we've been in response for, almost 2 years. So certainly some exceptions there. But that's what most people are probably thinking of when you hear disasters, hear about emergency management. But in emergency management, we also oversee recovery. So the actual putting everything back together after the disaster has happened. And then we are also responsible for preparing our communities for these disasters. So figuring out, doing risk assessments, doing trainings, exercises, plans, all of those things that go into making us be more efficient and effective in how we respond and recover. And then we also oversee or are supposed to be in charge of mitigation, which if you work in the climate space at all, you may kind of interpret more as adaptation. But we refer to this as hazard mitigation. So these are things that we're doing in the long run to try and prevent disasters from happening. So not just readying ourselves for them when they do happen, but actually doing that prevention part and trying to stop them from happening in the first place. So emergency managers have a full plate here. This full cycle is pretty extensive. It covers a lot of ground. It involves the need for a lot of expertise and funding and resources. It's also important to keep in mind that, we're kind of talking more and more these days about emergency management in the context of natural hazards because of the climate change threat, but they are involved in what we call all hazards. So essentially anything you can think of that could go wrong, emergency management should be thinking of it and planning for it. Again, this is an extensive list and again requires extensive expertise, extensive resources to be able to really adequately prepare and address all of these different potential threats. Of course, as emergency management is doing this work, they're relying on a vast array of stakeholders. So when we talk about emergency management, there is the profession, but there are also essentially everybody else is part of this system as a whole, right? Other government agencies have a huge influence over how we respond, how we prepare, how we mitigate. You have nonprofits that are involved at every stage, businesses involved at every stage. The way that media is influencing emergency management cannot be understated. Everything from media coverage during disasters to a lack of media coverage during the recovery. They are, kind of can be the drivers of mitigation happening in communities. So they have a huge influence over the system. And then, as I said, we're all part of this system. All of us as individuals have a role to play when it comes to disasters, even if it's just how we have personally kind of prepared ourselves for a disaster, but also individual decisions that we make are going to have a broader influence over this system, right? So whether or not you're wearing a mask, whether or not you're getting vaccinated, right? Those are at their root individual decisions that are adding up to how we are seeing the response to the pandemic unfold, for example. So huge influence from kind of all parts of our communities. So as I mentioned, I'm part of the discipline of emergency management, and we are the ones who study emergency management. Disasterology, the title of my book, is a kind of much broader umbrella term that I use to describe all of disaster research as a field. So that broader field has researchers from history. We have economists, psychologists, sociologists, communication experts, engineers. Anybody and everybody in these different disciplines are interested in disasters. They bring their own theoretical orientation to studying disasters, which is so valuable. But all of that research can be very overwhelming, particularly for professionals in emergency management who may not have a research background and don't necessarily have time to go dig through these obscure journals to find the answers to their questions. And so the kind of answer to that has been the development of the discipline of emergency management since the early 2000s, really kind of in the post 9/11 era. And our job is to kind of bring together all of these findings from these other disciplines, kind of filter them through this emergency management filter so that it can be useful in practice and in policy. And we can, hopefully kind of change the way we're actually addressing these disasters. So in terms of connecting this all with climate change. So if any of you are working in environmental or climate spaces, you probably have done work related to problem one. I try to break the climate crisis up into these two very broad problems. So we have problem one, which is actually mitigating climate change. So this is all of our conversations about energy policy and solar panels and carbon and the Paris Agreement. All of that is largely centered around this question of mitigating climate change. How can we stop climate change, make it, try to get it under control as quickly as possible? That is a very, very important problem to be working on. At the same time, we have this second problem, which is managing the actual consequences of climate change. And again, what we use the term climate adaptation to describe. And this second problem is one that I think sometimes can get brushed aside a bit as we focus on problem number one. And again, what we do in terms of problem number one is incredibly important and obviously has a huge direct effect on problem number two. But at the same time, our reality is that to this point, we have not mitigated climate change. We are feeling the consequences of climate change. There are people and communities and countries around the world that are directly experiencing those consequences and need help. And so we have to address this second problem at the same time that we address this first problem. And from an emergency management perspective, we certainly have a lot of opinions about number one, but we don't have a huge amount of influence over it. But we do have substantial influence over this problem number two. And in fact, managing these consequences of climate change, at least in the consequences that manifest in disaster, is exactly what the emergency management system is designed to do. So when we think about climate change and how that connects with emergency management, the answer is that it essentially impacts everything that we do in emergency management. This is what I call a frontline system. Emergency managers across the country are already dealing with the effects of climate change in their communities. They're already having to respond. They're already having to think ahead about whether or not their community is going to be there in 10 years from now. And so climate change is affecting every single thing that we're doing. So in terms of thinking about the future and how we kind of deal with this problem, how we kind of deal with these existing problems in this system of it not being as effective and efficient and just as it needs to be, at the same time that we really kind of scale that system up because we have to deal with this increase in events, we kind of run into this very long list of things that we need to address within emergency management. again, in large part because of climate change. So climate change really is increasing the urgency for us to do hazard mitigation. Our emergency management system to this point, since the 1950s, has been relatively reactive to disaster. We kind of wait for the disaster to happen and then we respond, then we do the recovery. But we haven't really been proactive, particularly in terms of policy and in funding. And again, as this risk increases, we've got to change this. Climate change completely alters our risk assessments, what risks our communities are at risk of experiencing, how people think about which risks are most important for their communities. And we also need to find ways to be implementing mitigation in efficient and equitable ways. It's not necessarily just a problem of throwing money at FEMA to fund mitigation. That's good, we'll take that money, but we also need to make sure that we're spending that money in effective ways and in equitable ways. We also really need to grow the capacity of our emergency management system, particularly our local agencies. So across the country, we see kind of a wide spectrum of what these agencies look like. So you have kind of New York City on the high end, where they have 200 plus employees, they have millions of dollars going towards their agency. But that's kind of like the gold star for our emergency management agencies. Most of the country, most towns across the country at best have a part-time emergency manager. It's usually kind of in these small towns, the fire chief is doubling as the local emergency manager. And because they're so busy with their other job, they're kind of just going through checking boxes in terms of emergency management. You know, we're seeing these like cookie cutter plans that are just taken down off of Google and submitted so that a box can get checked with FEMA. And that isn't going to work for us moving forward, right? As our risk increases so severely, we're really beginning to see, you know, more than we were before, the consequences of not actually doing mitigation, not actually doing preparedness within our local communities, and kind of the rippling effects that not having that kind of strong local foundation is having on all of the other work that we need to do in emergency management. So we really need to see an investment in those local agencies. And then we also need to kind of once and for all here address our recovery system. In, you know, since I first saw recovery unfold in New Orleans, not much has changed. There have been some bills put through Congress that sound really impressive, but by the time they're actually implemented and we kind of see the impacts of those changes, it hasn't done what it needs to do in terms of helping people be able to move through that recovery process more quickly. And again, this is even more concerning as we start to see communities around the country that are getting trapped in what I call a cycle of recovery. So you have places like Lake Charles, Louisiana, places in Southeast Texas, parts of California that are experiencing disasters so close together in time that they cannot get through the recovery from one before the next disaster hits. And so you kind of just get stuck in this never-ending loop of response and recovery. And again, as we look at how resources are being used in various communities across the country, who has access to recovery resources, we see that it's often unequitable. We see that low-income communities, communities of color, are struggling the most through recovery. They're the last ones to get through recovery. And so we need to really reform not only the emergency management system as a whole, but particularly emphasize reform to this kind of recovery system. So that is my spiel. Like I said, this is the book. You can get it if you want to learn more. You can follow me on Twitter. I have my website up here. Feel free to go poke around, and happy to answer any questions now if anyone has them.
All Do we have questions?
Yeah, I've got a question about, you referred to Lake Charles and they're in a perpetual mode of recovery. Shouldn't the disaster planning and disaster mitigation look at those areas and basically, is it really responsible for us to take and throw good money after bad, rebuilding those areas versus moving those peoples out of those areas?
Yeah, it's an incredibly difficult question, and there are a lot of ethical considerations there as well. So certainly there are people in Lake Charles and, well, at this point, all parts of coastal Louisiana that are kind of done, right? They've flooded so many times, they've had enough, they want to move. So one thing for the folks that do want to move, we need to make sure that we have a system for them to be able to do that. So we call that a buyout program in emergency management. That's something that, the government comes in, buys your house, you take that money, you go move somewhere else, they turn that into green space. And so then, it's not going to flood again in the future, or there won't be damage in the future. That is an approach we've used in the US since through FEMA since at least the 1990s. It's one we're pretty familiar with. However, we've always done it on a relatively small scale. And one of our big issues and one of the big issues of climate change is how do we actually scale that up? It's also an incredibly slow process. An analysis by the Natural Resource Defense Council a couple of years ago found that it takes an average of 5 years for homeowners to move through that buyout process, which is really difficult when you're trying to figure out if you're going to be able to move. If you're not going to get that money, should you rebuild in the meantime? Then if you've rebuilt, then you probably don't want to move. So there are some real structural barriers to individuals being able to make that decision, even if they want to. So that's one change that's needed. And then in terms of, whether or not the government is going to rebuild an entire community, that becomes kind of a much bigger question, and get into all kinds of legal issues with land rights and whatnot. So yeah, really kind of complicated question, but certainly one that's at the forefront of how we're talking about climate change.
Hello. I was wondering, on a scale of moderately doomed to very doomed, where are we?
So look, I don't think the world is going to end tomorrow. So in that sense, not a 10, but it's pretty bad. Like I try not to sugarcoat these things. It's hard to say, right? It just totally depends on whether or not the US government, but also the international community actually pulls together and addresses climate change. And in that sense, I don't know, I think we're probably around like a 7 or so on a 1 to 10 scale. There are countries, right? There are places around the world that are already pretty locked into not existing in a few years' time. I mean, it is really severe in that sense. At the same time, do I think like the entire world is going to end? Like probably not. I think we'll probably pull things together before that. But certainly kind of depending on where you're located and kind of what resources you have, it may kind of feel like the end of the world.
We're in Minnesota.
Minnesota is probably one of the better off places.
Okay, with the poverty in the South as it is, and you were talking about 5 years coming from the South, I've never really seen anything change for impoverished people down there. So when we start experiencing mass change due to the environment, is there a plan in place for the people that are going to be moving and migrating upward due to that? Because they have nothing. and they're coming with nothing, and they're going to need care when they do move. So is there a plan in place? Is there acknowledgement that there's something going to happen?
I missed the last part of that, I think. Are you asking if there's a plan to move people inland?
Yes, if there are plans
Okay.
to move people inland, is there a plan to move people out from the west when it becomes such a desert-borne area that it can't produce food anymore? Maybe.
Yeah, so the short answer is no. So we do not have a comprehensive national climate adaptation plan. There are politicians who talk about the need for that, or at least the need to think about managed retreat, which is the term for what you're describing, of how you move entire cities or entire regions. But that plan does not currently exist, as far as I know. I don't know, they may have some classified plan, but not publicly, no.
This is a very interesting thing. So since we're all asking these morbid questions about how long the world has, I might as well pile on. Isn't the bigger concern with climate change, maybe the more urgent concern, even though it's a long developing cycle, the conflict that will arise that's coming, so it's not that humanity's going to die, it's that we're going to start fighting over space and water and food, things like that. Can you comment on this?
Yeah, sure. So there's a range of impacts, right, from climate change. So I focus on the more kind of acute disasters, but certainly we know food supply, water supply, and then those at the root of civil unrest, et cetera. This is something where, we're starting to see this play out on like a relatively small scale in certain places, right? You can look at the influence of the drought in Syria, for example, as kind of the notorious example. But it's easy to kind of draw out, well, if there's no water, then this happens. If there's no food, then this happens, right? So yeah, those are definitely all possibilities. Again, it gets kind of hard to game out exactly what that future looks like, because at so many points there could be interventions to change the way we think about water rights, or to change the way that we're distributing food around the world. So there are ways kind of out of that. I don't want to say it's necessarily inevitable. It's all about kind of how policy reacts and how policy evolves. And there's the kind of more optimistic view of that, and then there's the more pessimistic view.
Well, a question on a smaller scale, but how do these communities get flood insurance when they're repetitively flooded? Is that, for people with means, if you can't get flood insurance, you're probably going to sell your property and move.
Yeah, so flood insurance in the US is kind of a really unique situation. So the vast majority of people across the US that have flood insurance purchase it through the National Flood Insurance Program, which is a federally backed program. And in that way, most people, as long as your county is eligible, you should be able to get flood insurance through that program. One issue is that most people don't know that flood insurance is separate from homeowners insurance. So we see a lot of people who should have flood insurance do not have flood insurance. Another part of the issue there is that the flood maps across the US are wrong, to put it most simply. FEMA has been working the past 10 years to try and update them, but it's a very slow process. And they still don't really account for climate change in those in the current flood maps. It's also like a very highly political process that each community goes through with those flood maps. And so a lot of people don't have flood insurance for those reasons. The requirements in terms of who actually is required to purchase flood insurance is pretty limited to people that have a federally backed mortgage. So many, and you have to be in a certain flood zone on the flood maps, but if the flood maps are wrong, then you see where we start to break down here. And then another kind of twist here is that very often the line of thinking here is, well, if somebody can't get flood insurance for their property, they're going to move because they're not going to want to live without flood insurance. When in reality, we see that people just stay where they are and they just don't have flood insurance, and they just kind of cross their fingers and say, well, hopefully it works out. And so across the country, there's only about 5 million households that actually have flood insurance through the NFIP, which is far fewer than should. I was going to say something else about this. So yeah, so we need reform within the National Flood Insurance Program, essentially. And the way we're doing it now isn't really working for most people.
Any other questions? All right.
Is there sort of like a national food and water bank for a large scale emergency?
Can you say that again?
Like, is there a large scale food and or water bank for like large scale?
Yeah.
You mean like a national stockpile?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so as part of the national stockpile, there is food and water. To my knowledge, it's not like what you see in the movies necessarily. Where there are those resources, they tend to be within the military rather than within the emergency management system.
I'll add that I really liked your slide about the two problems. The problem one is climate change, like the mitigating climate change. And then the problem two that just doesn't get talked about enough is the effects, responding to the effects, because we are seeing the effects now and we are going to continue seeing the effects. So they are talking about like disasters in the news, but they aren't. They don't, definitely, just like climate change, they don't have the urgency, do they? The urgency of, hey, these disasters are going to continue to happen. More of, oh, we will rebuild. I guess I don't really have a question. If I'll follow up that. Oh, do we have somebody else with a question? All right.
Yeah, I will follow up with what Heather was talking about. Just kind of being a reactive species versus a proactive species. And your background in psychology, do you think that's just like human nature to be kind of that reactive species? I don't know if you could comment on that.
So yeah, I to an extent, I do think though that part of the reason, at least with disasters, that we have been very reactive in the past is that we didn't necessarily have the knowledge for how to be more proactive. We rely a lot on what I call the hazard sciences. So hydrology, seismology, volcanology, the people who actually like study those hazards that become disasters. And even if you think about something like meteorology, for example, and how far or how much we've advanced the science of meteorology since, just a couple of decades ago. I mean, it's incredible the advances that we've had in those fields. And that has enabled us to be more proactive in emergency management for things like hurricane season. So I think some of that reactivity in this context has actually come from a lack of knowledge and a lack of resources, a lack of technology. And so I do think that we're in kind of a different situation now where the pieces are at least there for us to be more proactive. Whether or not like politicians and the other people who are in positions of power to actually make us more proactive do that, that is maybe, the kind of big question there.
Well, that gets to the question I have. The mitigation and preparation. And you don't want insurance until you need it. And so a national level of preparation and mitigation, as evidenced with like to rally the political will to fix the car than to put insurance on the car. So what are your thoughts on the cost and the political ability of making those investments?
Yeah, I mean, we need national emergency management reform if we're going to deal with these disasters. You know, Congress especially has put us in this position of us having to pay the bill for their inability to act to this point, right? If they had started to address climate change, if they didn't wait so long to deal with infrastructure maintenance, we wouldn't be in this level of risk that we're in right now. And so kind of on the one hand, it's like, this is the consequence of not being proactive. This is what we're dealing with now. And like at some point, they've got to write the check, right? And it's hard. There is not a single member of Congress that is calling for emergency management reform. It's not even something that's being discussed yet at that national level. So clearly there's no appetite for it, and there isn't even an appetite to really have any kind of broader conversation about, you know, financing this side of climate change. We're barely kind of being able to finance the kind of mitigating climate change side of things. So it's a extremely toxic and difficult political environment that emergency management is trying to kind of navigate through right now. And unfortunately, I don't really have a lot of good answers here other than saying that we need more people advocating for emergency management and emergency management reform. You know, there has to be kind of a groundswell of support across the country for Congress to make changes to even get it included in that national narrative before we can even, you know, start talking about actually writing policies that we need.
All right, any more questions? All right, then.
Can you end us on a happy note?
Yes, I will. Here's my happy note. Have you guys seen the trailer for the new disaster movie that's coming out in December? It's called Don't Look Up. It's an Adam McKay movie. Meryl Streep is in it. She plays the president. It is about a comet coming towards Earth, but very heavy-handed metaphor for climate change. So that is something for us to look forward to at the end of the year here. Hopefully some politicians will take note of the metaphor and do something.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.